Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel, and welcome to this 2016 Toyota Tundra TRD Pro with a 3URFE 5.7 liter V8. In today's video, we're going to fix every single common problem with this V8 in one go. Let us get started and we'll talk about it some more. So here are the common problems that we are fixing with this particular engine. The first thing is, which is the main thing that brought it into the shop, there is a ticking sound from the driver's side from the timing chain. This is something common. When these engines are cold, they'll tick, and then when they warm up, it goes away. That's actually just a tensioner ratcheting, but the owner wanted the whole timing chain replaced, so we're going to do that as well. The second problem, cam tower leaks. We're going to actually address that, and while we're doing the chain, we're going to do the front timing cover as well. And the last thing we're going to do is the heat exchanger leak right underneath the intake manifold. Very common to leak on these, and this one is not leaking too bad, but while we're there, we're going to just tackle everything. We're going to put a new water pump as well, and many things in between. So we're going to put you on a time lapse. We're going to start tearing it down. We're going to stop and talk about the important things as we get to them. So let's get to work.
This engine, of course, replaced the UZ series engine, a beloved engine and a Hall of Famer, and an engine that is not only one of the best Toyota engines ever made, it's one of the best engines ever made, period. When this engine came out, it kind of solved the concerns, or not really complaints, but concerns with the UZ engine. First, it lost the timing belt, of course, is the timing chain engine. And then it was basically a modified 2GRFE, at least in my humble opinion, because there's a lot of little things that are exactly the same. There's some parts that are interchangeable between the 2GR. If you're not familiar, the 2GRFE is the 3.5 liter V6, which debuted in 2005 in the Toyota Avalon and many other models throughout the Toyota lineup. The only difference, at least major difference, of course, oil pans will be different, valve covers, this, that, that's the obvious stuff, but internally, the only big difference is the 2GR has one big chain and one big tensioner that keeps the cam synced with the crank. The UR series engines, they have two chains and two tensioners, and ironically, the reason we're doing this entire job is really the second chain tensioner, because if you look at the position, and we'll look at that later, they're actually exactly the same location, except the UR series engine, they have the other tensioner with a gasket and something, just a strange setup. And ironically enough, that is the one that has the issue. But this, folks, is one of the good engines. I wouldn't call it one of the greatest engines. It actually does have issues, and that's the norm. Nothing is perfect. Yes, they're reliable engines, but it's a very big V8. One of its, in my opinion, I've worked on so many of these since they came out till now that they're gone, basically discontinued, except in some performance models like the RCF and the LC500, IS500. But the biggest issue with this engine is its size. I mean, you take this engine, you put it on an engine stand, you put a UZ next to it. The UZ looks tiny compared to this one. It's just so big, and that's one of the things about it which makes it difficult to work on. So the cylinder heads are very wide, similar to the 2GR as well, has the same thing. The front cover is very large. The cam orientation and the way it protrudes from the cylinder head, especially the cam gears, they're huge. It makes it extremely large engine, and that's one of its things. The Tundra is the biggest Toyota that they have put it in. The Land Cruiser, for some folks, will say it's bigger. That's actually not the case. I think the Tundra is larger engine bay. It's still very tight. It's doable. You can do everything. And some mechanics will actually pull the body off the truck, which is doable. It's not very difficult. But again, when we get to older cars with rust, the less you disturb, the better. And that's my philosophy, at least. I don't like to tear half the car apart just to make life easier for me and break many things in the process that should have never been moved or touched doing this job. So access is difficult, not as difficult as some domestic trucks with the really high nose and big radiator in the front, but Access is difficult to this engine, but everything you really need to do down to a cylinder head, you can do it in the car, which is good. Unlike the 2GR and some models, it's really not something we can easily do. But having said that, we're basically coming up to the first common issue, and you're going to see it, which is the valley plate leak. It's right underneath the intake manifold. Just note, if you're only doing that, you don't actually have to take the engine completely apart like we did here. All you got to do is pull the intake manifold off and you can access it. Just drain the coolant and do it. I'm giving these tips in case you're following this DIY. You actually don't have to remove the radiator and the fan and all that. You can just go straight into the intake manifold, take it out, and then you're right there at the coolant valley plate. It's a little tricky to do it without removing the front cover, but it's possible. You just got to be careful and take your time. And with that, I want to say one thing about this engine. When you look at it in the engine bay, most DIYers, which I love and hold dearly to my heart, you will see it extremely intimidating. And you know what? I agree with you, but I will say one thing. This particular 3UR, I think other than the coolant pipes, which you see very clearly here in this part of the video, it is actually not bad. Once you start removing some of the covers, move some of the wires, and start working, I think it is a simple engine to work on if you are somewhat experienced. It's not the easiest Toyota engine to work on, but it's not one of the hardest. Except in the LS460, things get a little bit more complicated, but for a Tundra Sequoia like 3UR, the FE that you see right here, they are pretty simple. They are very DIY friendly, but not your first engine to start working on if you're just starting to DIY your car. With that, let's go to a live video and we'll continue this conversation a little bit later.
So we got this far. I wanted to show you something. You probably didn't catch it on the live stream. We have residents in this Tundra. Yeah, look at that rodent nest right there. Before we pick it up, let's knock the door. Hello, anybody there? No, it looks like an abandoned one. Well, you can also see the coolant here. That's the valley plate, and you'll see it once we get it out. I can probably get this insulation out of here so you can see. Oh yeah, just look at it. I don't want to remove this yet. What I do want to remove is this thing. Nobody in there? Sure. Okay. Oh wow, they didn't even, there's probably insulation somewhere from this truck. I don't see it from here. It's probably the fender liners or something. He just grabbed it and brought it here. But I don't see any chewed up wires, so that's very impressive. So we're good. We can go through this thing. I'm gonna clean this once we get to, I just wanted to make sure we don't have damaged wires. But I don't see anything. This one is fine. Knock sensors are fine. We just had a line cruiser. You guys remember that video where this was chewed up. This one has a giant nest and not chewed up. Well, you never know. So we're gonna keep going. I think pretty soon we're gonna start heading towards the valve covers, then the front timing cover. We'll get all that out. And then last, we're gonna pull the cam towers out. And it would be the halfway point where we start assembling everything. Probably when I get everything off, especially the front cover, we're gonna dive into the valley so you guys can see it as well, how that comes off. Not exactly a DIY video, and this is not exactly a DIY job. A lift really is helpful with some of the stuff in the side, but you need to take down the AC because this line is in your way. But overall, it's not a bad job. We're gonna keep going at it here. We're gonna put you guys back on the time lapse and we'll talk about some other things.
So this particular job, I'll tell you one thing and then we'll kind of talk commentary about the job itself. I'm removing some of the front stuff. We're heading towards removing the valve covers and then the front timing covers so we can get going on the chain and everything. We'll talk about that live as well when we get there. But one of the things I wanted to tell you about this particular job, and I remember this from the dealership days, this is the kind of job that, for reasons beyond me, I don't understand it. I mean, it's not that bad. Technicians some technicians at least, this will be the day they would call off. And when the job has been given to somebody else and it's done, that's when you text them, hey, job is gone, so you can come back to work now. It just, for some reason, Toyota technicians do not like this engine, do not like working on it. I was one of the people that I like it. I think I love this kind of work, and this is the challenging work. Yes, it is taxing on your body because you're leaning over the truck for a very long time. And one mistake equals you're doing this all over again because there's a lot. That particular section that I'm taking apart in the video right now. That's one of the most complicated ones. You're going to only see that in some models, not in all of them. I feel like that was an afterthought because there's a lot of hoses that are connected there in a way that is just abnormal to Toyota usually, because they did not want to route the water pump through the front cover. So they did all the hoses, all the pipes external, and then it was a very strange orientation. So the water pump has a pipe behind it that goes through the heat exchanger, and then in the front all the pipes are external. Normally this stuff either runs in the intake manifold or underneath it, or it goes through the front cover into the engine. This one, everything is external, and that's what makes this a little bit of a slight mess. And it's very easy to make a mistake here. There's so many hoses and so many little stuff that you could easily forget one of them, and that's why I have done this before, where you have a leak after you started because, oh, we forgot to put a clamp. I usually pressure test these when I'm done because it's the best way to make sure you didn't forget anything, because there's so many hoses. And then that pipe that you're seeing me take it off right now, that pipe is actually a bad design in my opinion, because there's one bolt that holds it that is right behind the AC compressor. It's like we could have put it in a better position. So you basically have to remove the AC compressor if you want to replace that pipe, which is not the best idea. That's a pipe similar to the UZ series engine, but in the UZ series engine, it was placed in a much better spot. But now that we got that pipe that runs down, by the way, is for the oil cooler. But now that we got that out, we're kind of heading towards removing the wire harness. The wire harness on this is a little big. It's a big V8 engine with a lot of sensors and a lot of stuff. But the driver's side, notably, is a lot easier than if you're doing valve covers on this engine. The driver's side is a lot easier than the passenger side because you don't have the coolant hoses in your way. You don't have all that. You do have the fuel lines a little bit. And the harness is easier to pull back. You can just peel it back. The passenger side has the wiring go underneath. It doesn't go all the way. Like I believe the UZ series, it goes all the way down, and you can't really easily remove it. And this one, you can. It does have a jumper connector where you can unplug it, and then everything else stays. So the wiring that runs down this way, some of it goes to the starter, some of it goes to oil level sensor if you have one. This particular one doesn't, and goes to a few other things. But things are going well. We're heading towards that last coolant pipe, which is very interesting. And here is something interesting about the UR series engine. So when we started this job, I didn't record it in the time lapse, but I drained the coolant from the block and from the radiator. There's two block drains on this one, so we drained both of them. But it is always the same thing. You drain the block, you're expecting no more coolant. Well, there's a lot more coolant in these pipes. And because of the way they are so high up, and they just never drain, and you have coolant sitting up in them, and it always makes a giant mess. And that's just how it is. And you'll see when we take this pipe finally, you'll see a lot. And one thing here, right, this section, when you take the heater hoses, be careful. For some reason, Toyota likes to use this very flimsy pipes that come out of the heater core. You gotta be careful, because if you crush it, it will never seal, it'll keep leaking, and you basically have to pull the dash and replace the heater core to really make them work again and not leak. But at this point, we are kind of clearing up the accessories. We're taking off the power steering pump, and the alternator is a strange one on the UR series engine. It doesn't have the front bolts and a bushing. It has side bolts, which is something not normal with Toyota. This is kind of a one-off. There's a few models that have it as well, especially like the new A25A has that. But valve cover has a lot of bolts, and you're going to see me pry it in very specific locations. So this is the same as the 2GRFE. The valve cover has guide pins, because actually there's oil passing through the valve cover for the VVTIs and whatnot, so that you have to position it exactly in the same spot. That's why they put these guide pins. They love to seize. You got to be careful when you remove them. If you just kind of use force and pull it, you could actually crack the valve cover. This is heads up. Same thing with the 2GR FE. But so far, we actually did have one casualty in this job. That's the only casualty till the end, and we won't talk about it in the live video, but I will tell you what it is right now. One of the cam sensors on the passenger side, as soon as I went to pull the connector, the wires just came right out of the connector. This is something I've seen happen before, and you just repair it. It's not a huge deal. But on this particular engine, especially with the cam sensors, I've seen this before. And another heads up on this engine, the VVTi solenoids, they were initially not marked, and you can plug them the wrong way, especially on the driver's side. And this is something that some technicians have a lot of issues with. They do this job, they're done, and they start it. It has all kinds of timing codes, and they take it apart multiple times to make sure the timing is good, and it's too good, and they're kind of wondering what's going on. So they made a change to the wire harness on the driver's side, and even on the passenger side, but it's on the driver's side that is a problem. They put a white tape over the exhaust one. So when you go back in, or it's best to mark it in case that tape falls off, but if you see a white tape, that is exhaust side on the solenoids. And front cover is coming out. Front cover is massive on this. It's a little scary because they don't give you good pry points. You have to really be careful. Make sure you got all your bolts. With that coming off, let's go check it out, talk about the chain.
So we just pulled the front timing cover. I want to show you actually the original problem that started this. Let's take a look. So this is how this looks like. You see the two chains, one for the left bank, one for the right bank, two separate chains. Now listen to this sound. I'm going to first play the clip of the sound that this truck makes. And now listen to this. Doesn't sound exactly the same. So just for note, and this is the important part, this is not the problem. Most people will tear this down, do this, be like, well, there it goes. That's actually a normal thing for these, because this right now has no pressure. When you pressurize it, this will pull the slack and we're gone. But what happens with this particular tensioner, it's always the driver's side. Very rarely have I seen the passenger side do that. It won't pull out. It's supposed to take this slack as soon as you start the truck. When we get this out, we'll talk about it a little bit more. But it doesn't. It gets stuck when it's cold, and it doesn't take the slack out when you start the truck. And this is what actually starts rattling. But when the truck is off, and it's been off for a while, this is actually normal, folks. And this is the confusing part about this. I hope I am making sense here. This is the tensioner that caused all this mess. And there's something curious about it. And this is, if you were the designer of this engine, first, I don't know why you would be watching this video, but tell us something. There is a gasket here on this tensioner, but this other tensioner doesn't have a gasket. There's a gasket. You can kind of see the edge of it here. Right here. When we get everything off, I'll show you the new gasket and whatnot. But I don't know why this side has a gasket and this side doesn't, and this is this side with the problem. Why did they put a gasket here? Possibly to make sure this gets enough oil. But this was not something added on later. This was there from day one. Because I remember I tore an early 07 Tundra for a broken valve spring, and it had that. So this was not something added on later. Now, a few things we're going to talk about is this little pipe here. This is the heat exchanger, or the valley plate as folks like to call it. This is what leaks. This is part of that valley plate that leaked that we talked about a little bit ago. There's a pipe here, and that's what makes this very difficult, because this pipe goes here, it has an O-ring, and then it goes into the front cover. This makes this job very difficult to do without removing the front cover. You can do it, it's doable. But it's very high risk because you could roll this O-ring. And this is the common thing that happens with them. One other thing that I checked, we're going to remove the cam tower next because this one is leaking. I checked the lifters, make sure none of them are collapsed. They're all good. Same thing on the other side. So we're good with that. We are putting a new chain and new guides and new tensioners everywhere. That's what the customer wanted. Just didn't want to take chances because they really love this truck and they want to keep it for a long time. Pretty involved job, and while we're there, I talked to him about the cam towers. This side has a very small leak, but if you got to this point, but even if you're having this job done, you know, you're just doing the tensioner, take care of the cam towers. Yes, it's going to be a little bit additional, but this is the time to do it. This is super common. Even if it's not leaking, take them out, clean everything, reseal them because they love to leak on these. Otherwise, this engine doesn't really have a lot of other common issues. Yes, we had the broken valve springs, but that was the early ones. If you have an 07, 08, check the valve springs because you'll see one of them kind of collapse and sitting on each other. It might work fine, but if you see that, this would be the time to pull the head and take care of that. Or you can even do it without pulling the head. A little tricky, a little risky, but if you got the cam tower out, you just pressurize the cylinder, pop the thing. You need a special tool, but it's doable. Folks, this is the plan, and we've been talking behind the camera, me and Jose. I was gonna leave the cam towers on, take the heat exchanger out, but then I want this stuff out of the way. It'll give us a little bit more space. So I'm gonna take the cam tower, first the chain, then the cam towers, then we're gonna dive into the heat exchanger, take that out, then we're gonna run down everything. We'll show you the whole engine, kind of the midway point of the job. We'll show you the parts and what's involved in this, and then we'll start assembling.
Let's talk about one quirk actually with the UR series engine, or at least the 3UR. So the timing gears are massively different between this version and the LS430. So what I'm going to say here applies to the 1URFE and the 3URFE. The gears, the VVTi gears, are actually very similar, and don't quote me on this, they might actually be exactly the same as the 2GRFE ones, because the timing this engine is one of the most confusing propositions if you've worked on a 2GRFE. If you've never worked on a 2GRFE, it might not be so bad, because the timing gears actually have markings that are exactly the same as a 2GRFE, but you don't use none of them. I mean, there's like 6 marks on the gears, timing marks, that you will not be using. And the repair manual is extremely confusing. So just heads up, if you have worked on a 2GRFE before and you're working on this, don't think they are the same. They are not. You will only be using one mark, and this is not exactly a DIY video, but take your time with the marking. And I'm saying this at this point because before you take it off, inspect the marks and make sure you are familiar, because it will take you a very long time, if this is your first one, to really figure out the timing marks. Because I just feel like they wanted to go with something. I mean, let me explain what actually those markings are. So in the 2GRFE and even the 1GRFE old and new, they use bank 1, bank 2. So bank 1 will have 1 dot mark, bank 2 will have 2 dot marks. It's pretty simple. You just line them up and we're good. But in this one, you will see the 1 and 2 marks, like 1 dot and 2 dots, but you will not use them. You will use the 1 dot. And this is the most confusing thing about this engine. I don't know why they did it this way. I wish they would have did this a little better, but they didn't, and that was one of the quirks of this engine. Cam tower is coming off, and the cam tower, of course, they're under tension, so you have to take them in a specific order. Cam towers are something that really scare owners of this particular engine because of how involved it is, and basically this is the point where they just came out. And then the valley plate leak. Once more, I will say this. If you do have a valley plate leak, you actually do not have to remove all this. Again, we're doing this just in one shot. It makes it a lot easier when the front cover is off. Honestly, I will suggest something here. Whenever you have the front timing cover off for a reseal, a chain tensioner, whatever the case may be, if I were you, I would pull that intake manifold and just reseal or replace the heat exchanger. We'll talk about why we are replacing the heat exchanger per se in a bit in the live video, but I would do it because this would be the easiest time to do it, except the secondary air injection valve. I mean, whoever designed the secondary air injection valve, we love you, but we know you can do better. I mean, it is such an awkward position, and you're kind of in a rock and a hard place, because what makes it difficult is the pipes that run to the exhaust manifolds. And if you remove them, it'll be very easy, but I can almost guarantee you, the minute you try to remove them off the exhaust manifold, the stud will break, and now you're replacing the exhaust manifolds, or potentially pulling them out just to drill this stud that broke, because there's absolutely no room to drill it in place. So here's that heat exchanger. You'll see it come out in a bit. We're cleaning some of that coolant. By the way, coolant, you can just wash it off with water. It'll break down, but I don't want to put more water here because we're going to use sealer soon. I did that later on when it was completely dried up. But here's that heat exchanger coming out. let's go to live video. We'll talk about a few things.
We're halfway through the job. Everything's torn apart. I was looking at these tensioners because when we removed, this is the driver's side, this is the passenger side, here are the new ones. When we removed this was actually stuck in, it wouldn't come out. Now, after moving it for a while, it comes out. It was definitely shorter than the new one, but now, because we've been moving it back and forth, it came out. So something's going on with this one. This is the one that has the gasket. I also noticed that the gasket broke in half. Now, I don't know if this was because of the removal, but something is going on with the driver's side by design, because it's the only side that has a gasket. And the only thing I can see is, if we look here, this has a very large pocket. So I imagine it takes it some time to build up oil here when it bleeds down when it's cold. But this side has a much smaller pocket, you see it. So I wonder if that's why they put the gasket, just to help it build up more pressure quickly. That's the only thing. But with this job, this is what's difficult about it. And the first ones that popped up, technicians were like, what's going on here? Because you can't really see it until you run it, and when you run it, you can't really see it. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. You can only hear it, and it's only on the driver's side, and it's a very difficult one to diagnose, but eventually it became a known issue where you hear it's a very distinct sound. Once you hear it, yep, it's a tensioner, kind of not pumping up all the way, but eventually it pumps up, and the sound immediately goes away, and it's literally like on off, and it goes away. As soon as the tensioner pumps up and pushes, it goes away. And let me show you why it doesn't. This problem is not the grenading type. This is a locking tensioner. Do you see, even if you have zero oil pressure, when you push it back, you see this lock? It locks it. Now it's mechanically locked. The lock is right here. You see how it grabs? If I push the lock to the side, then you can spring it in. Now this one is full of oil. I'm going to spring this one so you guys can see it. This one is new. See how I can push it? Now, Toyota, in the newer engines, like the A25 and M20, they switched to a spring type. That one relies heavily on oil pressure. There's no mechanical lock in case of failure. Now, there's good and bad. The bad about that is, if you have oiling issues, the chain will just be completely loose. But at the same time, you have more flexibility with temperature. This, if the chain all of a sudden gets too tight or too loose, you cannot really push back much. So you don't have that variance in temperature. The good thing about these is they don't cause grenading. If you lose complete pressure, it's just going to lock in this position, but see how much it is. It's going to move this much and lock. Now this is extended all the way out, but this is how much movement it has, and that's enough to cause a loose chain. Same thing with this one. Look how much this one moves. That's enough to cause the chain to be loose, especially at lower RPM. It'll start just clattering around. But because it locks, it's not going to ever push back all the way, and just the chain will come off, and we have all kinds of problems. Now these are all the parts we're doing for this shop. This is actually the heat exchanger. I always replace these. I've had enough of them where they develop a tiny crack, and then a month later it's leaking again. Don't want to deal with that. I always tell the customer, this is insurance. Let's put it this way. Because when you pop these, they're so tight in there, sometimes they develop a tiny crack. You won't see it until it's all back together, and then we're back to square one. So this is an insurance policy for the customer, for myself. I always tell them up front, we're putting this because I've seen these crack. It's up to you. Most of the time they go with it because it is a recommendation. We're putting new guides, new chains, all four chains, even the ones between the cams. We're not replacing the cam gears because there's not really a known issue for these. Belt tensioner, idler, thermostat, bunch of gaskets, new drive belt, and of course the water pump. Let's look at a few things, why these things leak. You always see this in front cover and cam tower. Actually, let me show you what actually happens. Do you see how this is the area where the head, this is the cylinder head, meets the block, and there's this line. Do you see how the appearance of this is like different than, say, here? That's because oil contaminated that area. And once oil gets here, eventually the sealer will start pushing through it and opens it up, and it starts leaking. You look at this area right here, same thing. And you notice this particular area in these engines, You see how just by taking it apart, all kinds of oil pools here. See, that's oil. You see, this one doesn't have this appearance. This one does. It's like, it almost looks like yellow sealer, not gray. I hope you can see it well on camera. I'll show you another spot where it makes more sense. But this is why these things leak. Contamination from the factory, pretty standard. If you look where the head meets the block on the other side, you don't have that appearance. Do you see how it's, I just smidged it now. Let's look at the other one. Do you see how it's gray? It hasn't been contaminated. And that's why. Now the other thing that leaks on these is a cam tower. Let's explain the cam tower because they're sitting right here. This is a cam tower or cam cradle or cam carrier. That's the official name. It only holds the cams and then the cylinder head is underneath it. They potentially did this for many reasons. Many folks will tell you many reasons. Possibly for manufacturing, possibly for better cooling because they're separate units. There's a lot of reasons, but unless you're the engineer that made this, that's the design Toyota goes with. What happens with these is, between this and the cylinder head, there is sealer. And you notice this particular one was leaking a little bit from here. Many people will mistake this for a valve cover gasket leak, and they'll do the valve cover, and they're not fun on these, and then they'll leak worse, sometimes because you disturbed everything. Let me flip it, and you'll see exactly the same area. See how it's all wet here? Especially in this corner. You see how that sealer is yellow, not gray like this. Now there's some oil here, but I'll show you on the car because it's really clear where it's leaking from. Now in the car, I'm gonna have Jose do the stretch. If you look all the way, this is the side that was leaking. If you look all the way in the back, you can clearly see there's an area that is yellow and the rest is like gray. I'll point it in the video here so you can see it. That's where it was leaking from. And again, contamination. Because you see how the oil pools in that area? And if half a drip come down, that's all it takes in the factory to cause it. You see how the oil pooled up right in that area? Let's look at the other side. Now the other side was not leaking, but the same area was starting. It was actually yellowed, so it was only a matter of time before it starts leaking all over the place. And this is why these things leak. Pretty big job to do this. I mean, this is, by the way, just to give you a perspective of time, we've been working on this since 9 o'clock in the morning. Right now it's around 4. Again, we're filming, so things are going a little slower, but this is a big job. It's not, you know, a DIY weekend warrior job. Let's get it done. No, there's a lot of stuff that you got to be careful with. The cleaning's got to be done well. You need a lift. There's no way around it. Some of these bolts are really difficult to get. And the main thing with these is you want to check, if you have one that's an 07, 08, whether it's Tundra or Sequoia, you want to look at the valve springs. You're going to look at any of them that is lower than the rest. They won't make any noise until they completely break, and then it could just flat out grenade the engine if it falls down. You want to check them. The later ones, it's not as common, but still, you got to this point, check them. Same thing with the lifters. Make sure none of your lifters, when you push here, none of them just fall in. These are all tight. We already checked all of them, but that's what you want to check. If there's a lifter that's collapsing, this is the time to replace it. They're not super common on this engine, but again, we got to this point. If there's anything, this will be the time to get it taken care of, bleed the lifter or replace it, and we're good. Something with this engine, and we'll talk about that when we get it started. The lifters, even though you never took them out, never did anything, they tend to pump down a little bit when you leave it open like this for a while. So they'll clatter a little bit until they pump up. There's nothing you can do about that. And then the last one, the big one, the heat exchanger or the valley plate leak. Folks, this is a heat exchanger. It just keeps coolant here to cool the valley. That's why it's called a valley plate, because it's a plate that sits on top. This leak is many reasons why it happens. People say the sealer. People say, well, I will tell you one thing. It's actually not the sealer, because people said that the factory used the wrong sealer here. It's not really the case, because look at this sealer. This is gray sealer. This is what they use for oil stuff from the factory. And look at that sealer. It's actually black. That's the coolant sealer. So that is not the case. There you go, black sealer leaking all over the place. This is the coolant sealer. I think this is like $100 a tube or something like that. That's not the reason. It's just a pressure point. Coolant and sealer don't always play along very well over time. They just leak. It's a weak spot. I think, in my opinion, like at least in my humble opinion, I think this surface area right here is too small to really hold sealer wear for coolant. If you notice where, like in the 2GR, where the water pump is, you do have a different, like a much thicker area where that is. But here it's a very thin area. You don't really have a lot of sealer, and they put a lot of sealer. I mean, look how much sticks out here. But they still leak. I mean, this thing was leaking all over the place here. So that's the issue with that. These are really the common problems with these engines. Biggest thing is cam tower leaks that start leaking on the exhaust and make all kind of mess. This one is just starting, but since we're here, let's take care of it. The chain tensioner one, although I haven't seen one completely grenade, and I did tell the customer, the owner of this car, but still, it kind of takes your piece when you're trying to keep this thing for a long time, and it clatters like it's gonna blow up in the morning. People want it done. Same thing with the front timing cover. This front timing cover, we're actually leaking a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit on this corner, very little in that corner. But this basically takes care of all the common issues with this. Drive belt tensioner loves to go on this. Water pump loves to leak on these. So that is all gonna get taken care of. We are actually at the end of day one. I set a goal today with Jose here. If we tear everything apart, when we get it all ready for reassembly tomorrow, we did pretty well. We still have technically an hour to go on our 8-hour day, but I think we're gonna call it. It's getting a lot because this is our 6th day working. We're doing this on a Saturday, so we're gonna call it a day. We're gonna catch. For you, it's gonna be a few seconds. For us, it's gonna be one night's sleep with our family. We're back. We'll clean everything and start assembling this, and I'm hoping everything goes smoothly and you guys hear it run after all this.
Welcome to day 2. We actually filmed this video. The first day was Saturday, and shop is closed on Saturday. We normally never work Saturday or Sunday. That's one day is family day, one day is God's day. But in this particular case, I wanted to film a proper V8 video so you guys can see what's involved. And it was very difficult to do this while the shop is going and filming. So we decided, me and Jose, we came in on the weekend and we filmed it. So this is the beginning of day 2. And before we talk about the job itself, let's talk about the cost. So this job cost $5,296. Pretty high. And folks will say this is a lot, this is this and that. But let me walk you through some of the parts involved, and there's a long list, so be ready. Labor, of course, is the biggest thing. It's a very labor-intensive job. Labor is right around 18 hours. What made this labor rate this high, it's actually usually a lot less than that, is we're adding cam towers to the chain job. We're adding new chains, because normally when you're just replacing the chain tensioner, you don't have to take the chains off. You're just going to take the one tensioner, hold the chain, and put it in, and we're done. And also we're doing the valley plate. We're doing a few other things, so that's what drove the labor a little higher. So we got 2 gallons of coolant at right around $52, although this actually took 3, but I didn't charge him for the extra one. We're not gonna keep charging and charging, it's okay. Oil, of course, is $70 in oil. Oil filter is $6. Drain plug gasket, there's a sealer, there's some cleaner, and there's a lot of gaskets. I'm not going to go through every single one because there's a lot of them. I mean, to give you an example, the valve cover gasket was right around $26, front crank seal $25. There's a lot of little odds and ends. But the chain guides, there is 4 chain guides. One of them is 79, one of them is 96, one of them is 51, another one is also 51. The tensioners, there's actually 4 tensioners. That's how this engine is. There is the little tensioners between each of the cams for that little chain. Those are right around 102. The main tensioner, the one that is a problem, is $85. The one that is not a problem is $102. And then we have the water pump is $179. Belt tensioner is $96. I think one of the cheapest belt tensioners in Toyota land. The belt idler was $111. The drive belt was $81. And then we have some timing chain sprockets at 97 and 51. The heat exchanger is 213. The PCV valve, which we replaced at some point, you'll see it, $9.88. And then thermostat was $57. Reason this is an expensive thermostat is it is actually part of the housing. The whole elbow comes with the thermostat. And at this particular part of the video, when I'm putting that cam tower, in case you are watching this and you've done this job before, yes, I did make a mistake right there. I actually applied the fippage in the wrong spot. And the fippage is a sealer, by the way. I'm just used to this lingo. I applied it in the wrong spot, and as soon as I tightened it and we stopped the camera, I'm like, something I am not happy with. So actually, I stopped at this point and told Jose, I guess, small break, lunch break for you, or just a snack break, or just take a walk and stretch your legs because you've been standing for a long time. I actually took that out, cleaned all the sealer all over again, and reapplied it. And the mistake was, when you put sealer, you have to watch where you put around the bolts. If it's a bolt inside the engine, you have to put the sealer on the outside. If it's a bolt that is outside the engine, you put the sealer on the inside. I hope this makes sense. You're basically trying to seal it on the outside. Actually, I had some inside the engine bolts that I put the sealer on the inside, which were supposed to be on the outside. I didn't like it. I actually caught it the minute I started to go on the second one. That would have been a disaster because it would have leaked immediately and we would have started this shop all over again. And that wouldn't have been good, but this is something you develop as you keep working on these engines and these cars day in and day out. You kind of develop that. I don't know what the term would be. If you know the term, say it. But it's kind of like you start, as soon as you finish something, you start thinking about it. Did I do this? Did I do this? And you start second guessing things that you're not sure about, and that's how you catch mistakes. I don't know what you call that. Muscle memory. I don't think that is the correct term, but if you know the term, do let me know. At this point, we start the very, very, very confusing timing of this engine because the repair manual is not very clear, and you kind of have to take the 2GR. Of course, I've done like 6 2GRs before this one, right before this one, so it's very confusing when you go into this one. It's like, why can't you use the right nice marks that just like the 2GR, but this one doesn't, and you kind of spend some time. This is a very jumpy engine, so you got to hold it, move it, and let's just say timing this engine is not one of the best design things by Toyota. They could have done a lot better, but hey, this engine is discontinued, so I guess we can't say much about that. Folks, this is a high cost job, and this is one of those jobs, I'll just be flat honest with you. I never hide things from you. Just say it as it is. If you get the time from the book, it is, I think, 8 hours or 7 something to do a timing chain on this. Actually, no, not timing chain, to do camshafts on this engine, which basically involves removing the cam towers. I think that time is on the low side. So the book, or that's what people call it, the book, that the labor guide, it is written by somebody. I always have a feeling, in every technician, if you're a technician watching this, please feel free to comment on this. I feel like some of the labor times are written by folks that have never worked on cars. They're just looking at the manual, kind of guesstimating a number. I don't feel like it's written by actually somebody that's done the job, because this particular job is always low on labor, and this is what made dealership technicians, I think, dislike this job. It doesn't pay well, and warranty pay was like 7 hours to do all this. It could take you 2 days to do this, and at a flat rate setting, this is not good. So I adjust my times based on the jobs. I'll give you another example. It just doesn't always go up. Sometimes it goes significantly down. Like if you go look at a control arm for a Sienna, a Highlander, many of Toyota models, you get the time from the book. It says 12 hours. Well, I'm not charging my customer 12 hours for the control arm. I mean, the most we will go is 5 to 6. I don't think we've ever went over 6. I usually go 5. If it's a really rusty car, we might have to cut the bolts, I'll go 6. But yeah, we're not. You have to adjust the labor time. That's why I wonder how other shops do this when they get a lot of different makes and models, and they're not really familiar with every single job. How do they do the labor adjustments? Like, sometimes you're going to be overcharging customers, and sometimes you're going to be undercharging yourself. And this is not fair to you, not fair to the customer. You got to be fair either way. I mean, this is a lot of work, and you can't just quote what the book says and all of a sudden find out 3 days later, okay, we really undercut ourselves here. You can't go back as the customer. You already agreed on a price. But for me, in my case, in our shop, we work on Toyotas. I've done a lot of, basically multiple of these, and we've done almost every job possible on Toyota, unless some custom jobs. We just kind of quote a time and go from there. And if we lose, we lose. It is what it is. At this point in the job, things are looking great. But I will admit one thing. When we were filming this, I was sick. So I was not feeling my best. Things were going very slow and lumpy. Because I was hoping in 2 days we would wrap this job up. I mean, usually if we were not filming, this would be a full day plus and a half job. I've done this a lot, but things were going at a very slow rate. And Jose will attest to that. He was right next to me. Like, I needed constant breaks because I was not feeling well. And things took long. And unfortunately, in this job, we had to roll into day 3, which will be coming up here in a while. I think we assembled the intake manifold and then we called it a day because I think I started to have a fever, so that was not good. We had to leave and I came back the next day and finished it. But things are going well. Once the engine starts going together, I like to cap my engine first before we start putting everything. That's not how I removed it, but I like to, once we get everything, to let the sealer set for the longest time possible. So get everything that has sealer in it first, and then work on the rest of it. So you see me tapping on the valve cover here. That is a rubber mallet. If you're going to do that, be very gentle. What I'm trying to do is seat those pins, because if you don't seat them, you can actually crack the valve cover, and that is very important not to do that. Especially on the 2GR, they're very common to do that. On this one, not as much, but if you're not careful, you could crack the valve cover here. Then injectors go in and all this stuff. But one thing I will say about this engine, you have to be organized with your parts. It's a medium amount of parts. There's not really a lot of little stuff that can easily be lost. I think what holds the record currently in Toyota land is the dynamic force engines, especially the new V6 twin turbo that replaced this one. I mean, the amount of parts that come out of that engine is unbelievable. It'll fill up half your shop. And that's how it is. I mean, the 4-cylinder version of the dynamic force engines has a lot more parts because it has a double front cover. It has a lot of little stuff for the intake and the EGR and this and that. This engine is not too bad parts wise. And always, every part I install back on the car, we get it all done in the bolts and whatnot. I look back. There's a method in case you ever wonder how mechanics don't forget things. I'm hoping all mechanics don't forget things, because it's really bad when you finish a job and you have a bunch of bolts that just you don't know where they go. You just end up tossing them. That's really not good. I understand mechanics will say, well, this bracket doesn't matter, that bracket doesn't matter. But that's, I think, what differentiates quality work from not quality work. And nobody's immune. Sometimes you finish a job, you have a bolt that you're not sure about. You can't just disregard and go. You have to be organized from the beginning, so you're not taking things back apart to put a bolt that you forgot. It happens, but you got to go back and fix it. I think that's the right way to do it. And a better method with experience to not forget things and be going back and forth and wasting all this time is to be organized about taking stuff apart. Now, I will admit one thing. Professional mechanics, we are not going to use Ziploc bag and label everything unless you're going to put this car away and not work on it for a year, which happens in restorations, for example. But keep bolts counted, or there's 2 methods. You either keep bolts at the part that you removed it, so you remember what they are, mark them in a way, or the method I use is counting bolts. Every component you install, stop and look at your loose bolts. You will always have loose bolts. For bracketry, for stuff like that, like the little bolts. These are the ones that you will easily forget. Count them. Every time you install something, we go back, look at the bolts. Okay, this is for this, this is for this. If I see a bolt I don't remember, I'm going to start scanning. Make sure where at the point that I'm at, I did not forget anything. Which in this job, here is the best part, we actually ended up with negative bolts. And that does happen in our shop. You drop a bolt, usually the little bracket bolts, they love to fall and you'll never find them again. And then, of course, you replace them. This is something also that happens. You replace them with the bolt. We always have bolts, in stock, the right sizes we use for Toyotas. The minute you replace that bolt, you will find the one you lost. It always goes like that. So I tell my guys, if you're doing a job, as long as it's not a specialty bolt, like something internal to the engine, if it's just a bolt that holds a bracket, holds something, replace it with a new bolt. And if you find the correct bolt later, switch it out. But if you don't, or it was missing to begin with, just put a new bolt and we know the thing is secure and we're not worried about it. Doing things right is important. So day 3 was extremely hectic. Folks, at this point, I am running at 75% capacity, a little better, but still not 100%. The shop is going. We come up to a very busy week. I think one of my techs were also not feeling 100%. He ended up leaving early that day because he was having a fever and he had to go. So things were really backed up in the shop. And I have this tying up a rack and I needed to focus and get it done. And this is where I made an executive decision a little bit, and I do apologize for that. If you're watching this video, you're used to our common video. I actually did not film the first start because we actually ended up pushing this truck to the side. Customer dropped it off. He went on vacation, so we had time with the truck. I pushed it off to the side, and we had to do other stuff to get it done because we were falling behind on things. And once we caught up, I actually came back, finished the truck, and you'll see it running and everything, but not the actual first start. But things are getting to the point where this is the point that you usually make mistakes in this job. Putting these hoses, this maze of hoses in the front of the 3UR, and the clamps are not cooperating at this point. And this is the part, if you're doing this job, this is the part you want to take your time, because routing every single one of these hoses right equals you're not going to have leaks. That's the most important thing. The second thing is you're not going to be frustrated later. Why is this not lining up? Why is my fan hitting this? Why is my belt hitting this? And are things just, this bolt doesn't want, its bracket doesn't want to go in. This is where you want to spend the time. And speaking of brackets and bolts, the coolant hoses, which I really dislike these coolant, I think they could have done this so much better, but they decided to do it external because that pipe, or these hoses, normally run underneath the intake manifold and you don't have to deal with them. But in this particular engine, they couldn't run it underneath the intake manifold because they have the heat exchanger, they have the secondary air injection, and they also have the oil separator, that big white black plastic piece that was on top of the heat exchanger. That is basically the PCV system is there because the valve covers were so busy they couldn't really do a lot with them. This part of the shop is a little confusing. You see how much you have to make sure that pipe routes underneath the wires correctly, some places underneath it, some places over it. So if you're doing this job, take your time with the following. The cleaning needs to be done right because that's the main thing. You don't want leaks afterwards. And this part, take pictures, take your time. Even if you're doing a water pump, you may have to move some of these hoses. So this is one of the bad designs of this engine. There's no other way to say it, because that bolt that goes behind the AC compressor is really a bad idea. I mean, you basically have to pull the AC compressor back to just get one pipe off. That is a coolant pipe for the oil cooler. Not the greatest idea. And folks, let us break from the tech talk and let's talk about what if you own one of these cars and you are watching this video, and although we're reaching the end here, but you're watching this video and you're concerned. Folks, let me reiterate one thing. The cam tower leak, when it gets really bad, it'll start leaking over the exhaust and you will have some smoking when the car is hot. The first thing I would do if I were you is to clean the leak, because I've seen these leak over 10 years and then you clean them, it'll take another 10 years for them to get back to this point. They don't always leak very much. So I would clean the leak first. and then see how long it takes for it to come back. If 6 months pass and you see nothing, we're done. Don't worry about it, because it doesn't justify you opening this entire engine. The second thing is, if you have a coolant valley plate leak, usually it's not the small leak, because the small one you won't see it. It's the big leaks that you will see. Fix it immediately, because it gets to be a pretty large leak that drains your coolant very rapidly. On the timing chain, the rattle, I would advise you to plan on doing it at some point, but I am gonna share this from my experience. I have not seen one actually grenade or cause further issues other than the clattering. The clattering is really scary. Sometimes it gets really loud. Like, I remember this particular Tundra. So the owner initially brought us the car. We inspected it to verify what we need and whatnot. And we scheduled the appointment like 2-3 weeks later. He was going on vacation. Said he was going to drop it off at the shop. And I think it stayed with us for a week and a half or something like that. So I remember when he pulled up, he wanted to confirm like the time, or there was a small change. He pulled up outside. I was in the shop. He opened the front door of the shop. I could hear that truck clattering from all this distance. That's how bad this thing was. But again, you did not see broken guides. There was actually nothing, no indication that anything was worn prematurely or broken. The chain still had its marks. So if you have this clattering noise, as scary as it sounds, there has been no evidence of it ever breaking something, breaking a guide, breaking a chain. But I understand that it's very nerve-wracking a little bit to hear that sound. Sounds like something is about to launch off the engine. So it's an expensive job. And folks, in all honesty, the owner of this particular truck wanted the new timing chain and wanted to do everything, but you could just replace the tensioner. But just know, if I were you, I would replace both of them just in case, because I have seen the passenger side do the same. Although on neglected engines with oil changes, severely neglected engines, but if I were you, I would replace both of them. You do not have to remove the timing chain for that, but you do have to remove the front timing cover. And if you did that, I would really look at those cam towers if they are leaking. It's a very small detour to do that. Yes, you have to take the chain in that case, but with that, we're filling it up with fluids. Let us hear this engine running, and then we'll wrap up this video.
And there you have it, folks. This car is done. It's ready to go. This was a lot of work, and you saw it. We talked about some of the costs involved, but the biggest problem with this job, I don't want to say could be a DIY job. I mean, you could, but it's a lot of work. Having access to a lift is really important. You will have issues with the one that are higher. It's going to be a lot more work because you have to lean into it, but in the end, it is just engine work. This is basically a glorified 2G RFE. You probably could see inside of it, but it's still somewhat of a mystery why this one tensioner only causes all this mess. There's a lot of theories out there. The opening got bigger, the lack of oil changes, that's probably the most correct one. Although this particular car is owned by one owner and they take care of it all the time, 5,000 mile oil changes, whatnot. But something is causing this tensioner to stick intermittently. It doesn't happen all the time. Intermittently sticking and causing this whole issue, which is now taken care of for this one, but there's a lot more Tundras out there that has this issue. But again, I will reiterate one thing in case you own one of these engines. I am yet to see one actually cause issues beyond the noise. So I wanted you to know that. Now, this particular Tundra, it had the coolant leak from the heat exchanger. It had a little bit of a front timing cover leak. So we were kind of fixing multiple things. And basically, everything you saw in this video, this is all the common problems in this engine. Yes, there's a broken valve spring, but it's not as common on the later years. This was only the first couple of years. Folks, I hope this video is helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber to the channel. Check out some of my videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.